Hello, everyone, and welcome to I'm going to call it Find Your Power podcast. My name is Christine Rasmussen, and I'm currently a graduate student studying for a master's in health psychology. Today on the podcast, I have Levi. Say hi, Levi.
Hello.
So we're going to be talking a little bit about stress and coping and just exploring that topic and concepts. So the first thing that I want to talk about or just contemplate is the multifaceted concept of stress and how it's been presented to me throughout my life. I feel like this is kind of a loaded question in a way.
Yeah.
How do you feel about that, Levi?
Yeah. It sounds like a multifaceted question for sure, not a easy band-aid answer or anything.
Right, and I think that kind of plays into part of just like the concept of stress and how that I was raised to even view stress, like kind of this not even really understanding of what stress truly is or means. And especially like dialogues surrounding stress in pop culture and the media. I feel like, and maybe my perspective from how I was brought up particularly influences maybe how I interpret pop culture and the media's, understanding of stress. But to me, it kind of seemed like stress or even just mental health or any issues surrounding that was kind of like taboo. Like, especially kind of brings me back to like when Britney Spears, went kind of rogue and like shaved her head and all that, or anytime like someone was having like, I don't know, like a breakdown and it was like a big thing and it's like controversy,
Very public too, yeah, and it was kind of rare back then, or seemingly so. I feel like it's the era of time we grew up in as well. I think stress was looked down upon, I guess, more so back then, and it's kind of more common to accept it for what it is in today's day and age.
Right, exactly. And I feel like just with the generations, like things used to be very, very like conservative. And I think that coming along with like the colonization happening made people very conservative, and that stuck with us for a long time. And our generation being, we were born in the late 90s, so mid to late 90s. And I would say up until maybe like 2010 was there like this breakthrough of like rebellion, I want to say, of like acceptance of, certain things that people would label as taboo or was not comfortable with, or it was deemed to be more keep that private and keep it pushed down, I guess, rather than allow others to see. It was basically like just acceptance of repressing our humanity, I want to say.
Right, yeah. And it was more looked down upon to have those human traits and things that everyone goes through every day, stress and anxiety and depression. But like you said, Britney Spears had her little mental breakdown back then, and it was earth-shattering. But today, I don't know that it would make the front page. Like, it's just another
Today
day.
Today it's like an aesthetic to be not put together.
Yeah.
And it's crazy how like it's flipped so much to where now it's like an aesthetic to not be a certain way, or to be messy or not have it all together. And I think that prior, almost like the perfectionism and that like need to like people please or like make it seem like or focus on your reputation. I feel like that all stems out of trauma, and it makes sense that like going back in the ages, like there was a lot of stuff going on. There was a lot of generational trauma being passed down. There was a lot of things going on in the world at certain times. I mean, all like, if you look at even like world wars and the things people were going through, a lot of those behaviors stem out of traumatic events. So it makes sense. But speaking about like generational narratives that were woven by my parents and my family, it's kind of hard because I try to think back on my childhood and how I grew up and stress, and it's like I don't even remember. It's hard for me to pinpoint stress in that because I feel like it was just an everyday thing, and it makes sense with my story and who I am for me to think that way. But I'm trying to break it down, like what was the beginning of that? But in reality, since the moment I was born, there was always stress. But how was it talked about in my family? I feel like it was never really talked about. It was just kind of labeled as like, life is stressful and this is how it's supposed to be. This is how it is. And there was never any emotional regulation going on for my parents or my mom specifically. And, you know, there's obviously there's forms of emotional regulation, but were they healthy forms? I don't know. It was, you know, running on anxiety and worry constantly. It was anger. And then also I feel like with, if we're speaking grandparents wise, like there was a lot of just dealing with it or like disassociation from it, and not allowing to feel it at all, in order to just survive, you know. And a lot of these were just survival modes and survival tactics that were being used. But then me as a kid, I picked up on that all I know is stress and life is always stressful and that it's always a battlefield. And I didn't have anyone teaching me how to cope with that. It was always just like, this is how it is. And, you know, it's like survival of the fittest, basically. I was also, you know, that child that kind of grew up faster or was like more mature for my age because I had to carry that emotional support role for the adults like in my life. And so me as a child that doesn't even know how to cope had to help others cope. It's like, how do you do that? I honestly don't know. But it developed this, like, I remember I used to say, like, I'm not good at expressing myself. I used to say that all the time when it's very interesting because I feel like I do a good job at, like over the years of however many years of therapy, having to repeat yourself and your story over and over again, like, then I know how to express myself. But I used to say that, like, that I just don't know how to express my own emotions, because it was always being repressed and I was always being told also how to be a certain way or what was accepted, right? And that could come out of pop culture too, what was acceptable and yada yada. But stress, like if you were stressed out, it was like a bad thing, like something's wrong with you, was how I felt or perceived it from the world.
Like something's wrong with you.
Yeah. And so it's like you also have to hide being stressed out because you don't want someone to be like, oh, she's crazy. And I don't know, like I grew up around just anxiety and worry, and that the world was scary and there was always something to be worried about. And everything was always like, or felt like the end of the world, you know, like I had to get a good grade on this assignment or it's like the end of the world. Right. And maybe that comes from like pressure to be a certain way or to do a certain way. And I did have expectations that I was held to, for me, and especially like using grades as an example. And it's funny, I mean, not funny, but it's interesting that now it's kind of become like a laughing matter. Like, oh, Christine was, you know, we were so strict on Christine that it's funny to them, but it's not really funny because it turns out to be like, you know, learned behaviors as an adult. But for an example with grades, like if I did get a grade lower than like a B in school, it was a problem. And so I had so much pressure and stress that I had to do it because it was a survival thing. If I didn't get an A or a B, it was the end of the world for me because there was some emotional blow up that would probably happen or something that would make me feel bad, you know, whether it be a fight or you know, parental discipline going on. And I say that with quotes, but end of it, whatever happened, if I didn't get that certain grade, it did feel like the end of the world to me. And so learning that over and over again in different situations, now it's like that emotional regulation is not there. It's 0 or 100, you know? So I don't know. I kind of rambled a little bit on that, but are you understanding kind of what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, definitely. I think family is probably the leading cause of most people's trauma, stress, and anxiety, whether they, I don't know, even people's family lives that look good from the outside can be stressful or anxiety inducing for the family on the inside.
Right.
I
And
think it's that
there's
way in majority of families.
right. And it's not like the example that I used is very, seems very like minimal, but there's like acute stress and then there's chronic stress. And acute stress is like the little things that happen every day that have a built up of pressure, but then it goes away. And there was a lot of that, but there's also a lot of stress going on chronically, like all day long. And then there was the big stressors, like people passing away in my family and my parents' divorce and me not, you know, knowing my real dad and a lot of like big life situations happening, along with the like acute stress that was all day long. And then the stress that you're picking up from your parents and other people around you. And then even stuff that was going on like in the environments, like a lot of it caused, you know, yeah, like bullying, and a lot of it caused, you know, like low self-esteem. So then you're stressed to have like social anxiety because you don't have a lot of built up self-esteem with that. So there's just a lot to it, but years of repressed emotions and non-functional nervous system because there's no roadmap to emotional regulation, just over time. And as far as like mentors and coaches, I really didn't have I had maybe one really great coach in sports when I was in school, and that was great. But I really didn't have a mentor or a coach or someone that was, you know, I want to say that I'd look up to for my whole entire life. I think maybe when I was working in the schools. I did have a good coach, intern coach there, and she was great, but I think she more kind of calms me, like kind of like a nurturing motherly figure, but I don't think there was much ever that anyone's ever said like, hey, use this coping strategy. It's going to help you with your stress. It was just, a lot of it was mask. Like, don't let people see that you're stressed or else they're going to think something about you, is how I basically interpreted it. And I underwent a lot of stress in working in the school system. And it wasn't helpful at all. That was another big problem, is that like, you can't be stressed out. If you're stressed out, then you're, I don't know, the bad guy. Another case of, something's wrong with you. If you're stressed out, then you must not be able to handle the workload. Then you must not be good at your job. Is basically how it felt.
Right.
Even though at that time I was doing a lot to help with my stress, like ice rolling and trying to journal and trying to paint and do therapeutic. Sorry, my dog is chewing on her bone in the background. So you might hear a little click, 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 but I was doing a lot to try to de-stress, but the support wasn't there, like with other people. And that's a big connection, I think, out of it all. As far as my own beliefs and behaviors regarding stress, obviously, there was the impact of my upbringing, which caused so much chronic stress, with my upbringing and, like how I was raised, with also the environment and the other people around me, everything that I was interacting with, I wasn't given the tools to be able to properly navigate my emotional self. So I ended up with multiple autoimmune disorders, which wreaked havoc on me. And now, back then, this was probably about 8 years ago, even with that, not once did a medical doctor look into the psychological and environmental impacts that were impacting my health. They were looking at it in like a biological, allopathic way. Like, okay, what's, her, she has a skin issue, right? A skin rash. So let's give her a medication, topical medication cream to go on it. And that was how it always went. She doesn't feel good, so let's give her a medication and see what happens. Up until I was like on maybe 11 or 12 different medications at a time, and I was getting sicker and sicker and sicker. But I was also the most stressed out too I'd ever been in my life. All the unprocessed trauma that I went through as a child. And it's funny too, because after my grandma died, I got like symptoms of IBS and stomach aches and all that when I was little, but no one ever looked at it. I actually got very, very sick afterwards, to the point where my parents brought me to the hospital, and the doctors didn't know what was wrong with me, and I wouldn't eat, and I was super sick. But no one said, oh, her grandma just died. Right. Maybe she's sad, and maybe there's something missing in the gap of how do we handle a child's sadness? How do we deal with that? But anyways, I had a built up of unprocessed trauma. I also I was in college, and I had just moved across the country without knowing anyone, from Las Vegas to New York. I didn't have a great roommate. She was stressful within herself, very mean person. I was rushing a sorority that they did it like the classic sororities where they emotionally haze you. And I was taking a full course load of classes studying neuroscience and psychology, which I loved, but I should not have done that many classes. I was partying and staying up late. My food wasn't great. Sleep wasn't great. Like, all of it wasn't great. I was in stressful relationships with friends. I had a hard time making friends. Or feeling that I was making friends. Maybe I was like self-conscious or had social anxiety. Also in toxic romantic relationships at the time, abusive relationships. No one ever asked me about that in relation to my health. And that's also when I got diagnosed with anxiety and had my first panic attacks. A little bit later that I get diagnosed with an autoimmune disorder, but no one ever connected the dots. So that's kind of how my stress management impacted the first half of my life. After having to force myself to figure it out on my own, that's when it got a lot better. But it took years to do that. And I had to slow down and take time for myself and do a lot of self-care. Now, my stress management probably, my stress management plan probably contains like meditation and mindfulness and yoga and eating good and resting if I need to, working less hours, removing toxic relationships out of my life, taking care of my body. There's a lot of different holistic things that I do now that I practiced before it became like more mainstream, right? Before I found all this like scientific research that's backing a lot of those things. And so I'm actually really proud of myself, like how far I have come from being so chronically stressed to the point where it made me sick and almost killed me multiple times, to now being in an amazing groove, being in remission, being fully healthy, not on any medication anymore when I thought that I would have to be on medication just in order to live. And so, I don't know, I'm pretty proud of myself with how far I've come with my stress management.
Yeah, I'd say you're doing pretty great from the sounds of it.
Thank you.
From where you came from to where you are.
Thank you. And I want to be able to share these tools with other people. And I want to also be able to understand more of the science behind it all so that I am able to fully articulate this to other people. So now we have some deeper questions that get into it all. What are some common misconceptions about stress that you've learned throughout your life? I think the big thing that life is stressful. I don't think life has to be stressful. I feel like that's kind of just a negative mindset. Yes, things happen in life, but it's how you respond to it and your perception to it that matters. Because there's always going to be the waves of life coming at you, the ups and downs, but it's finding that flow of like surfing those waves, basically. How have these misconceptions influenced your perception and response to stress? I feel like I talked or touched on that a lot when I was discussing my upbringing, my early childhood.
Right.
I think that I really did have a negative outlook on life, thinking that it had to be stressful. I feel like I put myself in situations that were stressful because that's how I thought it had to be. I thought that you had to work nail and bone. I don't know if that's a saying, for everything, you know, that it had to all be hard when it really doesn't. Actually, that I feel like that's a sign that you're out of flow, that you're out of alignment, is when everything seems to be in your way. Like there's a borderline of like a healthy challenge, but like life is just going to be miserable if you're constantly in the negative flow state, basically. Next question is, can you identify situations where you experienced acute stress versus chronic stress? How did you cope with each type of stress? I feel like with acute stress, especially like, yeah, I feel like acute stress, things like deadlines for things, I tend to procrastinate a lot, but I think it is having to do with like this addiction to adrenaline. Like after being like kind of living in a burning house where everything is chaotic all the time, like you're not used to the stillness of things. So now, and I feel like that happened for me when I was in college, when I became like that, because I was in a very stressful environment, and especially too after getting diagnosed with the autoimmune diseases and having health problems, I really did struggle with learning in school and my memory and brain fog, and I wasn't given any assistance from the university. So I developed a horrible relationship with my schoolwork and education, and so that's like my baseline, is to procrastinate so much that like you feel that chaos, that adrenaline rush. And so that's kind of like the baseline, and it's hard to reprogram my brain in that. But as far as chronic stress, I feel like my whole life I've experienced chronic stress in various different ways. I didn't cope with it very well, and I feel like I touched on that a lot. But now I've found a lot of amazing different ways to really cope with the impacts of chronic stress. And I think my favorite one is the sound baths, actually. Sound bath meditations have been really amazing. I feel like every time after I do a sound bath, then I'm completely just like reset.
Nice.
Okay. Last one is based on the scholarly articles that were assigned to read this week. How did each article increase your understanding of the concept? So I took some notes, some things that I was interested in each of the readings. I've done a lot of my own research on these topics, just naturally trying to understand my life and trauma and how to heal from all that. But there was a couple things that stood out to me with this. One thing was that you can't be calm and stressed at the same time. The body actually chooses which is more important at that time. You can't be both, which is actually kind of cool, because say like you're going to go into a sound bath meditation and you're coming in like stressed and anxious, and then you're able to hit that calmness, like your anxiety is going to fall away, right? So it's just about like maintaining that state of relaxation. And that's probably why people feel so good after they come out of a sound bath, because because they got rid of that stress, you know?
Right.
And you can see like almost immediate feedback, like after 30 to 60 minutes of just that, which is incredible.
Mm-hmm.
Next is that chronic stress actually, there is a mind-body connection to that. Like being stressed out causes things to happen within our body. And one of the things I wanted to touch on, it was adrenal glands and having high cortisol from chronic stress. That was actually something that came up in my lab work when I was trying to figure out what was going on with me. And also the immune system. When you're stressed out, your immune system shuts down. You are more vulnerable to getting sick, and you actually have a suppression of your white blood cells. Chronic stress leads to inflammation, and the body starts to attack itself. Which that there is literally almost the definition of autoimmune disease disorders. Right. And it's incredible to me how even like rheumatologists or medical doctors don't look at that and like make that connection. Mm-hmm. Like I've seen a lot of different doctors, and my rheumatologist never was like, oh, well, like, what are you doing for your stress management plan? Like, never. The one time, probably even most recently, he did recommend doing yoga, and thank God he did, because that kind of sparked my yoga journey.
Nice.
But not once did they bring up, let's create a stress management plan for you. No, that was non-existent.
Yoga.
So it's incredible that people like see autoimmune diseases and they're like, oh, let's find a cure for this, but they don't realize where the mind-body connection is. Like, they don't bridge that gap there. And stress, for me, stress is the number one thing that flares my autoimmune diseases. The number one thing. And when I was healing, when I was going into remission, or even just trying to fight this, I ate healthy. I tried exercise. I tried supplements, everything. But I didn't actually achieve remission until I addressed my trauma and my stress. I worked with a shaman who was a trauma specialist, who did somatic healing work for years. And that's the only time that I actually was able to achieve remission from my autoimmune diseases. And it's incredible. Something else that I wanted to touch on too was the James, and I'm going to butcher his last name, Lange theory, which is something that I actually learned about on my own, that I've been like able to repeat and teach to other people. But it's essentially that the theory is that we feel emotions because of how our body reacts. And Peter Levine talked about this too in his books. And that's kind of how I learned about it. But I very much agree with this theory. It's essentially that, like, we see a bear, our heart starts racing, and then our mind makes sense of it and says, oh, I must be scared. Mm-hmm. And that's how we process emotion and process our environment. And I agree with this, because when we are activated like that chronically, then it's like our system malfunctions randomly, Mm-hmm. your heart could be beating fast one day, or you could be shaking, and you automatically make sense of it as something negative or anxiety, or, maybe you're just really excited, but you've undergone so much stress and trauma in your life that you automatically connect it to something bad. It's like conditioning in a way, like Pavlov's dogs.
Right.
And I feel like that also goes along with the high cortisol, because once you trigger it so much, it's just automatically going to go.
Mm-hmm.
And spike randomly and flare. It's like a broken valve,
Right.
I think it's beautiful that it's becoming accepted and aware now, some type of awareness that there's a complex connection between our minds and our bodies. So just to touch on it again, that acute stress is short-term everyday stress, stuff like deadlines, traffic, sudden bursts of pressure that actually goes away quickly. Chronic stress is prolonged ongoing stress, fight or flight systems always being on. And when that happens, it's hard to get out of it because you're just locked in. For me, I was in like a frozen state for a while after just being in fight or flight for so long. Also, too, with chronic stress, sources can be less obvious. It can be like a narcissistic abuse relationship going on, or just like family life, or financial stress, and I feel like financial stress was a big thing for me too. And I look back on it now and I'm like, not that I needed to be, I think I grew up with this instilled concept of money and that it's not enough and it will never be enough. And it's also always in a scarcity mindset that I brought that into my adult life. And when I was in college and supposed to be focusing on my studies, I was worried about how much money I had and that it was never enough. And I couldn't do the things I wanted to do, or blah, 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 when I should have been focusing on schoolwork. So what did I do? I got a full-time job when I was supposed to be in college.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't have to do that.
Right.
So I put myself in these positions to almost reinstill the messed up, or not messed up, I guess just the toxic beliefs system that was encoded in me or programmed in me. Mm-hmm. Again, it matters how we perceive the stress, and that depends on how it impacts us. Because two different people can undergo the same stress or stressor, but it depends on how they perceive it, which ends up being, are they stressed or not? How did they turn out? How is their outcome? Because one person could be very stressed out for it, and they could get sick from it, or they could, have anxiety or depression or whatever from it. And the other person, say they go in with like a positive mindset and they have this toolbox of coping mechanisms to use, or they see it in a different light, the situation, they might fly by or fly free, and not have it affect them as much. And I feel like now I'm at that point in my life where I'm dealing with things like that in that way. And so I'm thankful to be able to reach that. What was interesting is, what are the different ways of how can we cope and deal with it, with the stress?
I don't know. Tell me.
So there's problem focused coping. So that's like something happens and you're trying to fix it or find a solution to it. Like, okay, this happened. What are we going to do about it? And I feel like I tend to do that a lot. There's emotion focused coping. So that's like finding someone to talk to be supportive, like venting to a friend or family member, or maybe having a therapist that you can talk with, having that community support, because that's huge. Journaling, meditation, breath work, self-care, doing things you enjoy, spending time in nature, hobbies. That's where people, I think, when they think about coping and how to deal with things, they automatically fall to that section, I think. And then there is meaning-focused coping. So I also fall in this category too a lot, is that what that means is finding meaning and purpose in the situation that you're undergoing. So connecting to something bigger than yourself. This could be connecting with others that are going through the same thing as you, or even like a support group, or volunteering to support a cause. I feel like a lot of people go to like advocacy, they try to advocate for something that they have experienced or been going through themselves. Also focusing on gratitude within their life and being grateful for the things that they have, or that, whatever it is. I feel like I fall into this category a lot too. I think it could be an impactful one though too, because it's like you went through this experience, and I feel like this is my story, especially with my work, is that I underwent this experience, and now I'm trying to find meaning and purpose through it all and be able to help others through the same thing.
Right.
It's like finding, turning your pain into purpose is what I like to use.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that was all with the first article.
Oh.
The second article, here are a couple of things that I pulled out of it. That there's a difference between feeling stressed and stressed out. And I'll expand a little bit more on that when I talk about allostasis and allostatic load. But there's a three-stage process that was developed on how our bodies or our minds work with stress. There's alarm, resistance, so that's like adapting and coping. So the alarm being like the stressor, the trigger.
Right.
And then resistance, that's how we adapt or cope. Some type of resistance towards that stressor, like get away from me,
Right.
And exhaustion stage is the third. That's where people could get like sick, burnt out, tired afterwards. You need to rest. So stressor, cope, rest. Allostasis is the body's ability to maintain stability even when you are facing challenges. So I kind of think about that like homeostasis a little bit, like how we have to maintain our temperature, our body temperature, our heart rate or whatever.
Right.
But we do that emotionally too. And there are allostatic mediators, that being like the certain hormones or chemicals such as cortisol. So when we are stressed out, cortisol gets released, and then we have a heightened energy and focus. And that can be good sometimes, but not in that chronic way where it's overloading.
I see.
There's also allostatic load. Have you heard about that before or no?
I haven't heard of allostatic load.
No.
Mm-mm.
I've heard it before, and maybe it's been in my readings or another class, but so it's the wear and tear on the body from all of that adapting that we're doing with stress.
Okay.
essentially like the price that we pay for constantly adapting to chronic stress.
Makes sense.
Mm-hmm. And so when people say that they're stressed out, they're overloaded. They're allostatic. They've got allostatic overload.
Gotcha.
And so the type of stress doesn't really matter. What matters is how long it lasts and how intense it is. And that's where you'll overload. So overload can interfere with learning, memory, cause anxiety. It can be hard for emotional regulation. You might feel your emotions more intensely. And I felt like that in college when I was having those issues with after getting diagnosed with my autoimmune disorders.
Right.
What was interesting too is in the article it talks about how chronic stress can cause high blood pressure, chronic high blood pressure that can damage arteries and result in heart attacks and stroke. And I don't think people see that. Actually, heart disease and heart attacks are like one of the top causes of death in humans right now. But they don't, they don't relate it to stress as much.
Right.
Like the normal person wouldn't say, oh, it's because I'm stressed out. They might be like, oh, I'm eating too much butter, or I'm not working out.
Right.
And you can feel it when you get stressed out. Your heart starts beating faster. Your blood pressure skyrockets. So we just overlook that completely as a society. Right. So there's a physical example of how emotions and stress and trauma can directly affect your body. Stress can also affect metabolism. It affects weight. Particularly, it can make you gain weight, but I think also lose weight, because I was also very skinny for a really long time. Now I'm more so normal weight, but also my balance has been normal, my emotional balance and mental balance.
Right, it works both ways.
It can make you crave certain foods, and also change and impact your eating patterns. What I thought was really cool is that it brought up that a powerful coping mechanism is mindfulness, and that what is mindfulness? Essentially being present and aware in the moment, noticing without judging, and being the observer of the reality without being affected by it. And that's something that I preach and I practice all the time. And it's just really cool that science is catching up to that. Also mentioned meditation and breath work as well. What else is good for helping stress or manage it is exercise. So exercise apparently can actually help by releasing hormones that counteract cortisol and other stress chemicals within the body. So that was cool. I feel like exercise, when I did yoga almost every single day, it really helped with that. It literally made my panic attacks go away like that.
Yeah, I've heard that all over the place.
And I feel like
Pilates, gym.
Yeah, I feel like doctors do recommend exercise a lot, but they don't really back it up with much. Yeah, they just say exercise.
Yeah. Just know it's generally good for you.
Right.
They don't emphasize that it's not only good for your physical health, but mental.
Also, eating a balanced diet helps too. It actually provides the body with the resources it needs to handle stress. And especially eating whole foods, limiting processed foods, sugars, caffeines, can really help. So, the last thing that I do want to mention that can help is supportive relationships. And I feel like it's hard when you've been through a lot of trauma and stress and you tend to isolate yourself to be vulnerable again. But finding, even if it's like a community group or a support group, or even just like, I made so many friends in my yoga studio and in my yoga teacher training. And even just going to the studio and knowing people there, and it felt like a very supportive environment. And it doesn't even have to be like a deep relationship with those people, you know, it's just knowing that there's someone out there that looks at you in a positive light, I guess.
Right.
So that is
like how you get trauma bonded through coworkers.
Mm-hmm. It's also very important is relationships and community, and I don't think people really put a lot of emphasis on that.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people that have really bad anxiety or a lot of mental health issues going on, severe ones, tend to feel like they don't have support.
Right.
It's probably, I'm going to guess, an educational guess, one of the number one things that are probably highly circled on, you know, and a survey is like, do you feel like you have support? And they probably are in the lesser end of that. So
yeah, I could easily see that.
Because loneliness is very, you know, common, and especially I think too in the digital social media age, more people are feeling lonely and there's more anxiety.
It's easy to distance yourself from the world when you have everything in your pocket.
Right. Well, that is all of my notes from the second article and the talking points that I wanted to hit for today's podcast. Thank you all for joining us in this exploration of stress and coping. My personal experiences, what I've learned through life, my upbringing, society, my experiences and my growth, as well as what I've learned through my educational classes and my own personal research. So I hope that if you listen to today's podcast that you got something out of it, even if it's some helpful way that can help you manage your stress. Thanks again for watching or I guess listening in this case. And I hope to continue bringing more knowledge.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you. Have a good night.